Hi everybody, my name is Tom Clark. I'm the CEO of the Metro Denver Economic Development Corporation, which is a 9-county economic development group that operates in Metro Denver and northern Colorado. But I'm really here today to talk about something that happened way back in 1982 and 1983, and that's when Fort Collins and the northern Colorado area discovered what we referred to as 18 months of beer, boosters, and battles. The arrival of Anheuser-Busch as a potential employer in metropolitan Denver. The project was extraordinary for this part of the country. It was a $500 million brewery. Today, that's worth in excess of almost of $1.5 billion of value in that property. It was twice the size of the Vestas Windblade operation that runs all the way from Windsor, Colorado down to Pueblo. Absolutely extraordinary opportunity, but with only 500 jobs. So what made it attractive to us? Well, it wasn't the 4,000 acre feet of water that they had, because we all know we live in a semi-arid climate. And people were saying, they're going to take all the water from us. What are we going to do? This is terrible, terrible, end of days. It wasn't really the issue, but there were lots of reasons to not like Anheuser-Busch. But what we didn't understand at the time when they came along is that they were only going to take 11% of that 4,000 acre feet of water and put it in cans and bottles and send it someplace. In the meantime, the rest of that goes back into the watershed, back into the Poudre River. But this was going to be a place with lots of fighting going on. But first of all, why would they come to Colorado in the first place? And why would they come to Fort Collins? Well, that's the beginning of the story. The reason that they came is that no one has made a beer syrup yet. In those days, when you moved beer, you were removing lots of weight, and it was mostly water. And so for Anheuser-Busch to be a successful competitor globally, but at that time in the country, there was this big gap in the middle of the United States, west of St. Louis and east of LA, where there was no brewery. And so the idea was, let's go someplace into the west and find a location, because the transportation costs from moving beer from Los Angeles to Denver or St. Louis to Denver were pretty prohibitive. They looked up and down the Front Range and into Wyoming, and the first place they looked was Pueblo. Now, Pueblo was a manufacturing town. It had experience with folks. It had a good labor force, and very aggressive in their approach. They give you the land for free. They give you cash. The community was all set to go. But unfortunately, the water in the river at Pueblo was too salty. So all of a sudden, here's Anheuser-Busch, thought they'd just found nirvana. They couldn't get to that kind of place. So they say, well, let's try Casper. And they go up to Casper. Well, Casper doesn't have a salty problem in its water. Casper's got a problem because it hasn't got any water. Could not accommodate them. So now they move down into the northern end of Colorado. They ended up in Greeley. Greeley had just acquired the Windy Gap's water in the mountains of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. And there was a lot of water. It was great water, but it was very, very, very expensive compared to river water around northern Colorado, like the Thompson River. Land purchase seemed to be easy. They could get the surface, but there was a little problem. Underneath the ground, and in Colorado, you can buy the top, but you have to buy the mineral rights if you want to control the entire state. There was a dentist who owned the mineral rights. And under that, he was pretty certain that there was going to be natural gas under there, and Bush wanted to offer a value to the entire property at what they thought were the price of gas that day. Dentist, on the other hand, wanted to sell for what he thought the price of gas would be somewhere down the road. So they got into a little bit of a fight. They had to buy the mineral rights, for one simple thing. The longest memory that we have as humans is our sense of smell. If you think of your sense of smell and I say gasoline, right now you can smell that in your nostrils. So you can imagine that you're at the little, at the end of your tour at a brewery and you're having a drink and you look out on the site and you see an oil derrick going and you're drinking that Budweiser and all of a sudden it smells remarkably like gasoline. Busch couldn't have it. So they end up in Fort Collins. Fort Collins was kind of a backup. They were continued to negotiate with Greeley, but Fort Collins was just in case. My counterpart in Greeley about that time when things were seeming to go completely sideways with the dentist called me up one day and very much agitated, and he says, "Tom, I just had a call from some guy from Chicago, and he's willing to kill the dentist for $3,000. What should I do?" Of course, me being a wise ass, I say, I'd negotiate. Because I came from Chicago, and I said, hey, you can get a heroin addict in Chicago for $400 to kill this guy. It'd be messy, but you'd be a lot cheaper. He did not think I was being very funny. But anyhow, while this continued to deteriorate, Busch decided to look at Fort Collins. What can we do? Where can we buy land? And who could buy it? They needed 1,400 acres. There was only one company in Fort Collins, the Everett companies, that could buy a piece of property that big and not catch anybody's attention. They had been home builders, developers. They had built all kinds of projects around Fort Collins. They were a big land developer. So this land gets acquired, and they begin to negotiate with the city of Fort Collins. This was a tough negotiations between these folks. Both suspicious. Fort Collins had a reputation of being kind of a no-growth place. Fort Collins was trying to figure out what exactly the negotiations would look like and would it be good for the city. They got to a certain level of negotiations, and they finally end up going up to Keystone, the mayor, city manager, and the top folks from Anheuser-Busch. And they did something very unique. They decided to operate on a principles strategy. In other words, you lay out a principle that both sides totally agree to. And then you begin to dig down into the project and into the deal. And when things go sideways and you get in a big snit, you go back to the principles again. And then you start over and work your way down. It was an extraordinarily successful approach, but it was still tough. But one of the things you know in economic development, sometimes incentives are a lot more than cash. And here's one of the things in a state back in the early 1980s that had virtually no incentives. Anheuser-Busch was going to have to build a sewage treatment plant for the facility. And that was a lot of money. That was several $1 million. Anheuser-Busch knew that was going to be a cost, and the city of Fort Collins did not have the money to be able to help them. But what Fort Collins did have was a sewage treatment plant that was not operating at full capacity. And it's the thing called BOD, biological oxygen. In other words, the more BOD there is, the better the sewage plant works. It's kind of like your car. If you're driving at 10 miles an hour, you get crappy mileage. If you're driving at 100 miles an hour, you get crappy mileage. But if you're about 55, you're getting the full maximum use of your car. Well, it's the same thing with sewage treatment plants. And so Fort Collins put up and said, we'll actually lend you this BOD until the brewery gets big enough and you have to actually build your own. That was worth millions of dollars to Anheuser-Busch, and it became probably the strongest incentive they had. Then we had to figure out how much money were we going to offer. And that's where our organization came in. We brought in an economist from what is now Wells Fargo Bank and said, let's take a look at all the revenue that goes to the city alone. Not the tax revenue that goes to the schools, that would go to the special districts, the library district, just to the city. And let's offer half of that for 10 years. Today that would be a joke. because it wasn't that much money. But in those days, for the city of Fort Collins, it was the best they thought they could do and get through their public. Now, was the city ecstatic? Well, some of us were thrilled to death, but the opposition formed very quickly. Screaming. All the water's coming out of the basin. Oh my God, drunken breweries will be assaulting children in the streets. This is a horrible thing for us. And the worst thing about it is that the beer is going to flow down College Avenue and it'll be consumed by a union person. These are Teamsters. Oh my God. End of days. Beautiful Fort Collins turning into a beer town. So there were lots of obstacles that we had to overcome. So first of all, the city of Fort Collins and Larimer County had agreed upon a growth boundary. In other words, to pack and densify the city of Fort Collins before additional expansion could be done. Most of the growth in Fort Collins went down by Harmony and I-25 going to the southeast. There was very little on the northeast. And so the urban boundary wasn't really getting to everywhere it was doing. It was just watching this growth to the northeast. The city planners and the business community thought if we could get more economic activity on the northeast side of town, that the entire city would kind of balance itself out. What we had to do then was we had to agree with the county commissioners to annex that land in, and the county commissioners had to agree to let the city of Fort Collins have an election to do that. For the city, it was a lot of money. But since the county was not going to have to participate in the incentive, it was going to be a huge amount of money for the county. Nonetheless, of the 3 commissioners, only 2 voted yes. The economist that we brought from what is now Wells Fargo called me up after she'd completed her work, and she said, Tom, we need to limit this to the number of years of telling people. The tax revenue for the city and the county and the school districts, for the hospital districts, are so huge, nobody will believe this. If we run this out 20 years, we'll be accused of lying. She said, let's limit it to 5 or 10 years so that the numbers don't get huge. Then came the idea of the union issue. And what people did not understand is that the Teamsters were never a threat to our existing employers. Unions tend to organize along industry lines. This was a beverage company. It had been a beverage company for over 100 years. Unions tended to organize in beverage manufacturers. They were also tended to organize in construction. But the public was still talked about it, and the opponents still made a big deal out of it. Now, when you have a building that big, and you have a site that big, you need an interchange because you're going to have beer trucks that are going to move this beer all through the West. We needed to build an interchange for them. And how would that be done? I mean, there's a diamond and there's 4 pieces of it. Who's going to pay each piece? We ultimately had the state pay for 1 leg of it, the city paid for 1 leg of it, and the other 2 legs were paid by Anheuser-Busch. It was about $2 million a leg, so they paid for half of it. Now, the argument from the opponents, of course, this was all about the rich people in town, the money people. They're the ones behind it. And for God's sakes, the last thing we wanted to do as a Chamber of Commerce back then was to lead this campaign to annex the ground in, because that was, everyone was expecting it. So we said to ourselves, what, if we look back on history, what would be the best way to do this? What we saw was the story of George Washington in the French and Indian War. This was the great object lesson from history. Washington was a captain, and he was fighting in the wilderness in the northwestern part of Virginia, trying to stop the French and the Indians who were attacking the Brits and with them the Americans. Washington was sending a message almost every 3 days to the British commander in Richmond, begging him to bring more reinforcements because Washington was being overrun. Never showed up. Never showed up. At the end of the war, Washington goes back. He asks the British general, I asked for all these reinforcements. Why didn't you do anything for me? And the guy said, because I knew the Virginia Company, which you worked for, stood everything to gain if you could conquer the wilderness. He said, that's why I didn't send it to you. So we said to ourselves, well, the last thing you want to do then is have Chamber run the campaign because everybody would think it was just the moneyed people. So we went ahead and we got 2 campaign chairs, and they needed to be at an arm's length from us. One of us was the recently retired female mayor of Fort Collins, a Democrat, and the female head of the Larimer County Democrats. Those 2 women became our chairs. They had incredible credibility with the public because everybody knew them. They also knew their party. But these 2 women had the same thing in mind. What were we going to do to help people in the community who weren't college educated? And that's where the issue for us became important. Hispanics in our community in those days were in a little part of town called the Andersonville area, which was up in the northeast corner of Fort Collins. Most of the folks were not illegal immigrants. They had come through a couple of generations before. They'd worked in farms with local farmers who were growing garden products like radishes and what have you. But they were mostly now spending their time working in service jobs, mostly working in hotels and restaurants and what have you. These were people who were making in that day $3.15 an hour. Now we knew, and Anheuser-Busch had told us, that they had a 20% affirmative action requirement in every one of their breweries. So we did the math, 20% of 500, there's 100 of them. Those people would move from $3.15 an hour to $17 an hour. If you were working in the crummiest job in the brewery, which was toting kegs on the dock, you would be automatically 100 families jerked into the middle class in Fort Collins. What a great opportunity for us to give a future to a minority population who were good citizens but lacked the tools to compete in what was becoming an increasingly technological city. So all of a sudden, 4% of the Hispanic families got jerked into the middle class overnight. It was a great thought for all of us. Their grandchildren now are probably, engineers and faculty in colleges and what have you. But then came the big surprise. Anheuser-Busch announced that they were going to burn clean Wyoming coal to run the brewery and to co-generate electricity. In other words, they would burn the coal, turn it into steam, run their own brewery, not take the money off the grid. Very inexpensive for Anheuser-Busch, very environmental to the company. They were also going to take the effluent that had come out of their grains that had been used in the production of beer. And they were going to spray that over alfalfa in neighboring farms. And that was going to increase the capability of the farmers to grow their crops, grow their alfalfa, but also to feed their cows. It was wonderful. We thought this was the greatest thing in the earth, and those high protein waste products would somehow end up in a fat cat or a fat calf someplace else. We thought people would say, this is really cool. And they did say it was really cool. And then they said, but tell me about this coal thing. Tell me about this coal thing. They're going to burn coal here? There was a slight problem with coal. And whether or not it was clean was another conversation. Now, under EPA rules, you have to have a guarantee that you will not create enough pollution that it goes above a certain level on any piece of ground. And it's called an increment. And if you go above that increment, if you get to 100% plus, you can't build there. So there was a study run. The study indicated that Anheuser-Busch would be using 99% of the carbon monoxide limit on that site. We said, well, what's the difference between 100 and 99, right? And the second question was, it's the largest pollutant on the Front Range in 1982, carbon monoxide. It was on everybody's lips as we were trying to find a way to take Denver away from its position as the #2 most polluted city in the United States, second only to Los Angeles. I can remember one time going to talk to one of the people at Grumman Aircraft in Los Angeles, and I was kind of pitching him about, coming to Colorado and putting a facility there. And he said, let me get this straight. You want me to move from the #1 most polluted city in the country to the #2 most polluted city in the country? How do you think that's going to go over with my board? So for us, what was an environmental problem was also a serious economic problem to us. Then we did something that today and almost any day in my career would be considered heresy. We came out and opposed the Anheuser-Busch brewery and its burning of coal as its source of energy. We knew it was unacceptable to the community. We begged Bush not to do it. They said it's going to be fine. We said, you don't know Fort Collins. Please give us another answer with this carbon monoxide problem. We didn't tell them we were going to come out in opposition. And when we did that, you can imagine what broke loose in St. Louis. Phones were ringing, people screaming, people's careers at risk. It was very, very painful for us to do it. But we knew if the public saw that computer model of 99% of the increment, we would lose the election. Now, I had a friend of mine in EPA in Illinois, and I called him one time and I said to him, what would happen if we do this? And he said, well, whenever you're doing a project this big, in the engineering department of a big company, is some guy sitting in a corner, probably named Irving, and he's doing the backup plan. If Anheuser-Busch is as great a company as we all know it is, there's an Irving in there someplace. 72 hours later, Anheuser-Busch called us up, said they were going to burn natural gas at the Fort Collins Brewery. And we went on to discover that the change from coal to natural gas went from 99% of an increment to 14% of a carbon monoxide increment on the site. The election passed 54-46. It was comfortable, but it wasn't a landslide by any means. The public still had suspicions. Flash forward to the mid-1980s, the beginning of the oil bust in Colorado, which hit everybody along the Front Range. Retail sales numbers went down, property taxes went down, schools and counties and cities scrambled for revenue, trying to hold their communities together and meet the needs of their citizens. In 1985, when the brewery was up and running, there was only one city in the Front Range of Colorado and all of Colorado who had a net income in taxes. As a matter of fact, a landslide in taxes. No loss. Guess who? Fort Collins, Colorado. Today, property taxes from Anheuser-Busch's brewery builds 3 new classrooms every year for the Poudre Valley school system, but only requires 1 classroom of space to train their kids. They're a net donor, a big net donor to the tax requirements in the state. Beer didn't flow in the streets. The tech companies did not get unionized. City manager was let go. The economic development director's contract, mine, was scaled down. I moved to Denver, to the second most polluted city in the country. And within 3 years, virtually all the staff, the key staff people in Fort Collins who had put the project together, had left Fort Collins. Is there a lesson there? Well, sometimes you have to do the tough things, and sometimes it has consequences. Some very good people left Fort Collins, not myself, but others. And we did it because we knew it was the right thing for the community. Today, Fort Collins has a AAA hockey team and an arena between Fort Collins and Loveland. It's beloved by its community. It's an incredible citizen of Fort Collins and the Larimer County area. Things are better because of that company. But these projects are difficult and they're hard and they require leadership. And the purpose of this chat with you today is all about what leadership is. Leadership sometimes is not so easy, and sometimes it's personal sacrifice. But ultimately, your job as a leader in Fort Collins and Greeley, Larimer, and Weld counties, your job is to do the tough stuff. And don't be afraid to engage people who disappoint you or people who disagree with you. My final story. You can do this without the acrimony and the hatred that can come from something as emotional as this. The gentleman who headed the opposition was a former 3M executive who had moved to Fort Collins to retire. He had no skin in the game, but he was articulate, and he called me up one day and he said, "Let's find a way that you and I can talk to each other as this campaign goes forward." Every time we competed against one another on the issue of Anheuser-Busch, both of us started our speech with this. Dale Maxey is my friend. He was my friend before this came to the public, and he will be my friend after this election. And Dale would say, Tom Clark is my friend, and when this is over, he's still going to be my friend. And to make sure that we were going to talk to each other, we decided that we would take our favorite sport, which was tennis, and we would get together every Sunday morning to play tennis. Now, I got to tell you, there were some Sunday mornings I wasn't swinging for anything but his head. But the point is, we made it. And until his death, Dale Maxey was my friend. Thank you all for listening.